co-production of Now This and The Appeal. We're joined today by Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti to talk about the crisis of policing in Los Angeles. 1 in 1,000 Black men are killed by police in America. People have taken to the streets across the country and the world after the recent police killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and too many more. In Los Angeles, more than 600 residents have died engaging with or in custody of LAPD just since 2012. Demonstrators calling to defund the police have pressured elected officials into taking action. Mayors of major cities, including here in Los Angeles, are agreeing to halt spending increases on their police and reinvest those resources into front-end community-based public safety programs like housing, education, healthcare, and jobs. And that's what we'll be discussing today. Welcome, Mayor Garcetti.
Thank you. Good to be with you. Appreciate you having me.
Even before these national protests began, Mr. Mayor, you were facing aggressive pushback from community members in LA who argued for a people's budget to counter your initial budget proposal, which would have increased the police budget. Since then, you've promised to spend $250 million on community-based social programs, including $150 million cut from the police budget. But still, there are more than 60,000 unhoused people in LA County, growing for the 5th time in just the last 6 years. And while there has been growth in shelter beds, in part due to your A Bridge Home program, which has opened more shelters in the past 2 years, still the vast majority of homeless population remains unsheltered in the city. These numbers don't yet factor in the economic damage from the pandemic, which experts say is likely to expand the homelessness crisis in LA further. And Project Roomkey, which you promised would secure 15,000 rooms in a month for people without homes, has only gotten to 4,000 rooms. How will you secure at least the 15,000 rooms needed right now? And will you commit to reallocating funds from LAPD's nearly $2 billion annual budget to help resolve this growing housing crisis in LA?
Well, all great questions and many in there. So let me try to unpack them one at a time. First of all, since I'm 14 years old, homelessness has been probably the reason, together with racial justice and human rights, that I got involved in trying to change the world. I've been volunteering on a skid row that is 50 years in the making. It has been not just about what a city hasn't done, but what a society has not done. The way we've dumped people when they come out of jail with no plan, the way we haven't welcomed veterans home, the way women who are abused and survivors of domestic and sexual violence are discarded in our society, and the way that we have no mental health care system really in the United States of America, unlike our peers. So when we get to the roots of these things, they're incredibly deep. And the largest growth in my budgets have by far been around human services and specifically homelessness. 2 of the largest measures, both at the city and county level, the 2 largest actually in US history at the local level, to build housing and expand services. And we've gone from probably housing about 50 people a day to this past year, 207 people a day, which is a staggeringly high and successful number brought on by a lot of people who are out there every single day interacting with people experiencing homelessness. I want to be clear, I never promised myself 15,000. I said that was the goal that the state had set. We have the largest number of those so far. We've called over 800 hotels. We have to negotiate with hotels and motels to open up their rooms, but we didn't wait for that. We took every rec center we could find and we opened up our own shelters in the meantime. And rightfully so, I think some of us in the homeless services community were proud that in an 18-month period, we were going to house about 2,000, 2,200 people in beds that would turn over once or twice a year for many years. Then in 6 weeks, we were able to house 3,000, and those numbers keep climbing. So we're going to keep stretching, but this is a resources issue, not just at the local level, but a resources issue at the national level. I said 2 years ago, we needed a FEMA-level response to the housing and homelessness crisis we have in our city and in too many cities across America, from our nation's capital in Washington to the West Coast. We couldn't get that. Finally, it took COVID-19 for the federal government to say, yes, we will pay for 3/4 of the cost of housing people before a disaster hits them, because we know 3 people a day are dying of homelessness in LA every day. So we looked at a way that we could move forward and make sure that, I could take my entire budget and it wouldn't be enough to solve homelessness. And I worked both on Bernie Sanders' platform and on Joe Biden's platform to try to make Section 8 housing now a entitlement. And think about this, and I'm sorry to start at the wide level, but if we're serious about solving this, let's not, dance around the edges. Where we said, if you're hungry in this country and you're poor and you qualify, you get food stamps, 100%. If you're poor and don't have health care, we don't think you should die, so you get Medicaid or Medi-Cal, as we call it here in California. But if you qualify for housing, there's a 1 in 4 chance in America and a 1 in 8 chance in Los Angeles that you actually will get housing assistance from the federal government. Every country that's ended homelessness has a guarantee of that, a right to housing. And until we get serious about that, the structural racism that is a part of homelessness, because between 33 and 42% of our homeless population is African American in LA, depending on how you count it. And we have about 8 to 9% of our county population African American. Or whether you look at the crisis of sexual domestic violence and our crisis coming out of the criminal justice system, these drivers of mental health and addiction, we have to take on seriously. The second kind of area of your questions was around policing and the police budget. And I do think this is a moment we either meet or we miss. We either will say that we put our money where our mouths are, and everybody has to squeeze. And by the way, for everybody who's just focusing on mayors and city governments, they're usually the least funded level of local government. School districts, which are woefully underfunded. We have a huge initiative in California called Schools and Communities First that would reassess corporations that have been paying zero property tax, essentially increases for 30 or 40 years, and put that into our schools where we're warehousing trauma and poverty today. And our counties, which are the places where we do put most of our human services throughout the country. Some places like New York and San Francisco have a city and county together, but most places those are separate. So all the mental health care, the trauma-based stuff that you see is all in the county budget. But I am intentional about moving city dollars towards those programs. And we didn't just wake up to that this past couple weeks. We've been building that with youth programs. We've been building that with the biggest expansion of in terms of percentage of people has been in our gang reduction youth development programs, whereas LAPD was going to go down by 100 officers in my original budget this year. So I think we have to stretch to go further. We have to meet this moment. And I believe that this is what we've been waiting for, including myself.
So for weeks, Mr. Mayor, we've seen video after video of police using so-called non-lethal force to blind and maim protesters, community members, and journalists. LAPD fired a foam bullet into the face of an unhoused man in a wheelchair. We also saw LAPD officers use their vehicle to drive into a crowd of protesters and then directly strike at least one. Protesters in Los Angeles have demanded an end to these kinds of practices. But your police chief, Michael Moore, has said protesters are just as responsible for George Floyd's death as the police who actually killed him. You have said that you think that Chief Moore doesn't really believe what he said. Is Chief Moore the right person to head the LAPD, given these inflammatory and false statements, given your constituents' clear outcry for leadership in LA who understand their needs and a non-law enforcement solution for them?
No, I think that very clearly. I want to say one thing, because the record keeps repeating that he said protesters. He misspoke and came back in a minute and corrected himself. He said looters, never protesters. And looting and murder are not moral equivalents. And I was bothered by that. He immediately corrected it. It was a long day, and then he apologized repeatedly. And I know it's been repeated over and over that he said protesters. Watch the tape. He's never, ever, ever said protesters, though I think it was wrong to ever equate looting and murder as the same. And he believed that was wrong too, and said that he misspoke. I think that has been laid to rest. Secondly, though, absolutely, those pictures in terms of whenever there is abuse of force, needs to be held accountable. We have dozens of investigations. We have 7 officers who have been taken out of the field already. We're reviewing every single video provided by people, as well as body-worn cameras. And I'm very proud to have led Los Angeles. It seems maybe trite now, but we were the first major force in America, and it happened the first 6 months I got on the job, to put cameras on police officers, which was novel and new. And now we have a record. Now we have accountability. And now we have the ability for our independent civilian-led investigations to get to the truth. And while many officers showed incredible restraint, I think the car incident you talked about, there were bottles and projectiles in that car, but we have a responsibility, whether it is as a public official or somebody wearing a badge, to never, ever break those laws or policies, and officers will be held accountable.
So the firsthand accounts, as you described, Mr. Mayor, show and describe brutal tactics by LAPD using tear gas and rubber or foam bullets against demonstrators.
We don't use tear gas in Los Angeles, and we have not used tear gas in 50 years.
An LA Times reporter was injured in Minneapolis by Minneapolis police using similar tactics. And now Congress is debating a total ban of the use of these dangerous weapons. Would you support a total ban on the use of rubber and foam bullets and tear gas in Los Angeles?
Yeah, we don't use tear gas, so we don't need to, and it's not part of our policy, and we don't have that. We haven't done that in over 50 years. I asked in the midst of this, when I saw the impact of what are, and I hate these terms, less than lethal. You see that 15% of people have some sort of permanent damage, and 3% are killed by these weapons. I think we need to move beyond them. I certainly called for that and asked for the tactics that we saw on that first day. And remember, put this in context, the day before, we had a police officer who nearly died from projectiles that cracked his skull. But that is not acceptable that the response be then, okay, we bring violence because violence is being measured towards us. We have to figure out a better way, especially when you have peaceful protesters who are out there expressing their First Amendment rights, to be able to protect them and not to have them fear or to see, as we saw an unhoused Angelino bleeding in a wheelchair from one of these so-called less than lethal rounds. If that's less than lethal, that's only because we got lucky. I think that there is an evolution of policing that has to happen wherever we can. Now, if there's a true, riot going on, that is a different situation, but that's not what was going on. We did have, as I said, the first night and a little bit in the second day, some force that was used against officers, but that is when we must stretch and reach to a different way of resolving, maybe sometimes stepping back. And that day, the police chief and I were together here he said in City Hall, he said, that's not the right tactics. He went out there and he immediately made sure that that wasn't continuing. In the following days, there were one or two very disturbing incidents and a good dozen more that we're investigating. And there will be accountability for those. But I also want to say that there were a lot of officers who marched along and took knees and hugged and started conversations. And so you have to have accountability on the first, and you have to also open up the space for us to create a new relationship where folks out there who don't have a positive relationship or positive sense of who a police officer is, and vice versa for any police officers who have an idea of who somebody is because they're protesting or saying something they don't like to hear, that is not acceptable. We have to find the common ground that was opened up in many ways by what we all felt when we saw the George Floyd video. And I'm very determined to make sure that that moves forward.
When you became mayor, the starting salary for a teacher and an LAPD Academy trainee were about the same. Now, police are paid around 30% more. Accounting for cost of living and inflation, teachers are actually making less than they were a decade ago in LA. You may not have the direct power to set salaries for LA Unified School District, but you do have the power to use the city budget to set up, for example, a city overtime fund for teachers, a city fund to supplement teachers so they don't have to pay for their own supplies, set up housing programs to ensure students have safe homes, and of course, actually increase the overall school budget. Have you considered setting up general funds for teachers? And will you commit today to creating one or allocating more dollars for the school budget?
Unfortunately, our system has an independent and an independently funded school district. As you said, I don't have authority over that, but as you recall, last year I helped settle this teacher strike, get raises for our teachers. I've been involved in helping hundreds of millions of dollars get to teachers where we should have those priorities. I also led the campaign shortly thereafter and raised personally about $10 million to put on the ballot a tax measure that would fund our schools at a proper level. Unfortunately, that went down by more than 50%, and it saddened me. I will continue to always lean in, and that's why this fall in California, the biggest commitment I could make that is billions and billions more than any kind of token little fund that we'd set up to help teachers, is to make sure that we have proper funding of our schools through the Schools and Communities First initiative. It's a coalition of labor leaders, it's a coalition of political leaders, it's a coalition of educational entities. And here in California, if you look at it, I mean, we are sometimes and have been in recent decades 49th, 48th, 43rd, and with a much higher cost of living, let's just call it out. We're paying 50 out of 50 states in terms of our per pupil expenditures. And that's reflected in salaries, that's reflected in what people pay out of pocket. If you care about racial justice, you need to show up at the ballot and pass that. Last year when we didn't, when we had business community who said, no, we want the school district to get better before we're going to support that, and they spent millions of dollars to defeat that, that is reprehensible. That's what systemic racism is about. And so absolutely, we partner all the time. We use city funds, for instance, to help safe passages to schools. We pay for all the crossing guards in Los Angeles out of city funds, even though it's a school district essentially responsibility. We spend a lot of money on after school programs, and I've expanded those personally, something called LA's Best, to give basically almost every elementary school student an after school program, a place for parents who are working hard to make sure their kids are safe and continuing to grow and expand. So I will continue to invest in our schools, absolutely. It is near and dear to my heart. But the biggest thing, and especially everybody in California, if you're looking, how do you take this pain and this rage of this moment, help us pass Schools and Communities First this November.
Back to policing tactics, Mr. Mayor. Violence interruption programs are non-law enforcement prevention systems that identify likely violent conflicts and deploy credible messenger responders who themselves are directly impacted, know the neighborhood, and have the trust of residents. They've been proven to work, including in LA. And a new polling from the Justice Collaborative Institute and Data for Progress shows that 7 in 10 voters support funding community-based violence interruption programs as a public health response to violence. Even though you have called for increased funding for these programs, you also cut funding for violence interruption programs in your April budget proposal. You have previously said, I'm too pro-police to stop listening to them. And when it comes to public safety, I listen to police chiefs and cops. First, why do you trust one of the most lethal police forces in the country over health and safety experts, doctors, researchers, and community members? And second, would you commit to increasing city dollars on proven violence interruption programs like we discussed?
First of all, I reject the frame. That quote was pulled out when I was talking about the difference between President Trump and immigration policies and police officers, police chiefs who say that we should not be going after our immigrant communities. So I want to put that very clearly in context, because you can pull that out. I've never said that I just listen to police. I do listen to the work that we have done to build trust with immigrants, and this abhorrent White House that has gone after immigrants, even today, where we see them going after them. That was where that quote is. So please put that in the proper context. I think it's very important. Second, absolutely. I'm very proud, as I've mentioned, we're actually going to go down by about 100 officers this year. We haven't increased the number of officers since I've been here at City Hall, but we have expanded by 50% those proven strategies that I've embraced. And actually, when I was a council member, started here in Los Angeles. We had a very sad occurrence in my district when there was a young woman who was walking with her boyfriend. She was 14 years old. Somebody rolled up and shot her in the back. She had never been criminally justice involved, not been involved with gangs or anything. And they were 2 blocks from a park at 6 p.m, and the park was closed. And at the time I said, this is absolutely unacceptable. Why don't we have the right interventions? Why don't we deal with things to make sure these things don't happen? And I took a risk, and we opened that park the next summer at dark till midnight with programming, with trauma-based interventions, with community building, et cetera. And the police department was very scared. They said it was going to be a place of shootouts, and they didn't want me to do it, but I pushed forward. That turned into something under my predecessor, Antonio Villaraigosa, and myself as city council president, called Gang Reduction Youth Development Programs and Summer Night Lights. It's now a national model. We've actually exported it even to Central America through AID under the Obama administration. What it does is exactly what you said. It takes people who have been in those communities for a long time, who've been criminally justice involved, and they become the peacemakers. They're the ones who intervene at very difficult moments. They were ones who are able to get in there and prevent crimes before they happen, intervene. And so we've expanded that first thing I did as mayor by 50%, the biggest growth of any one program. When you say that they were cut in this budget, there's no programmatic cuts in that, and it still remains an expansion. I also authored something as a council member that we've been implementing as mayor, that if you add $1 to policing, you have to add at least $1 to prevention and intervention. It was pretty groundbreaking in America. I think all cities should adopt that right now as well. And so we've seen whether it's crisis response teams, which are civilians that can come in at the most difficult moments, dealing with mental health, dealing with domestic violence, dealing with violence that has happened, or others. This is a moment to reimagine how we do public safety and not just put everything on the shoulders of our police. That's not a new conversation here in Los Angeles. And I'm so glad so many people are starting to look at those programs, things like our community safety partnerships, which when there is police, put them in a community for 5 years. And half their responsibility is knocking on doors and building relationships and getting to know community and vice versa, that transforms a community from the sense of I'm occupied to, oh, this is my friend and somebody I know and can rely on. That has been, I think, proven. We need to double down on that. And that's part of why I've tried to take that lead as a mayor and say, look, what can we reallocate from police budgets to be able to put towards public safety in a different way? I think that is pro-police, but most importantly, it's pro-Black community, it's pro-communities of color and low-income communities, and it's pro-progress. Peace doesn't have to come always behind a badge.
I'd like to go a little deeper into this, Mr. Mayor. Polling from the Justice Collaborative Institute with Data for Progress suggests that 9 in 10 voters support creating an agency that would shift most first responder responsibilities away from traditional law enforcement towards medical professionals and social workers. As we've covered here on this program, the model works well across America, including in Eugene, Oregon, Austin, Texas, Denver, Colorado. In Austin, for example, the new law means that when a person calls 911, the operator provides options for police, fire, or mental health. If the person chooses mental health, a trained medic arrives instead of an armed officer. You recently promised to require LAPD officers to receive implicit bias and de-escalation and mental health intervention training. But evidence continues to indicate that these programs do give police more money, but do not actually work. They do not substantially reduce police-involved killings. And more to the point, experts continue to show us that there is no amount of training that will allow officers to respond to situations involving poverty, mental illness, or substance use disorder, as well as a fully trained public health professional. Will you commit today to creating a health-based emergency response program that could eventually shift most first responder responsibilities away from law enforcement?
We're absolutely looking at all those programs right now. The Eugene one, I know, looking even at how Camden rebuilt its police department, and absolutely. And we're not new to that here as well. I do respectfully disagree that we don't need to have mental health training and implicit bias training for our police officers. And studies, including ones done here by UCLA, have shown that they actually can reduce violence, but they have to be good training. They have to be ongoing training. They have to be yearly, not just once in your career where you learn about your bias and learn how to not act on it. If we want to save Black lives, we cannot disinvest from the programs that might save Black lives at the hand of police officers. At the same time, 100%. We have actually seen the biggest growth, as I mentioned, we haven't grown as police officers. We're going down 100 this year in the earlier proposed budget. But we also have seen our intervention workers out on the street, for instance, with homelessness, thanks to the passage of Measure H, the largest measure in US history for homeless services, go up by about 1,200. So we now have an army of folks who, for instance, during COVID-19, did about 15,000 wellness checks and counting, where they are the ones who can intervene at those moments instead of somebody calling a police officer. So I absolutely believe in those programs. I think it's very important for counties and cities to build those together because oftentimes people don't know who to call. But we should do that through our 911 systems. We should look at opportunities on domestic violence when they're not a violent situation right there, the interventions that can occur, and especially where we have traumatized communities. Remember, violence begets violence begets violence. And if you don't intervene, and this is something we learned through our youth development programs, which now encompass not just intervening in so-called gang crime, but also looking at the way that we intervene in the cycle of violence, dating violence, what happens in the home. If you don't get to that with people who look like, who have gone through the same conditions of folks in communities, then you will continue to have people who don't understand a community trying to provide the answers to a community that has the answers embedded in it. And the last thing I'll say, this is important too, because people need work. Part of me doubling down on these programs and finding and stretching in a tough budget year beyond our reach. And that $250 million is just a beginning. We have coronavirus relief funds and others that we have to look at, rental assistance because rent traumatizes people. We have to look at the cash assistance and the feeding of our families because in the summertime when the schools are out, how are our families going to eat? We have to look at summer youth jobs, et cetera. This is the moment to look for answers inside communities, not bring answers to communities. And those are the conversations I've been having, extraordinary conversations every day, led by African-American leaders who have run nonprofits, who have been underfunded, listening to the folks in immigrant communities and our poorest communities to say, what do you need and how would you build it? I know a lot of people want to do this overnight. I think it's irresponsible to just do it overnight if we don't do it looking at the evidence of those programs like we have in Eugene and others. So we're deep into those conversations, talking to our colleagues and looking at the things that Los Angeles really has set a pace for. I know it's easy to paint the brush of like, LA sucks, whatever. We've reduced our officer involved killings to 11. You can say to 600, but look at the trend. The trend is really remarkable based not just on what we do with policies and procedures, on the education of officers, on making sure we push forward. And we've got a long way to go, but also because we are investing in communities. But this moment demands we all accelerate and reach for more. And I'm gonna have to end on this, unfortunately, because I gotta jump on another call. But I do believe that if we can't find that common ground, if this is, look, it's a really easy moment for us to have a circular firing squad, to point our fingers towards whatever the status quo is. I've said we have to look for enemies, not just amongst us, but amidst us. In other words, inside of us. What didn't we do? What measure didn't we vote for that would have helped the Black community have better schools? Or what haven't we done to promote somebody? Where haven't we actually taken the walk and looked that homelessness is a racial issue? This is the moment for us to take that prism. I've been waiting for this moment my whole life. I'm excited about it. I'm willing to take all the slings and arrows, be a part of the celebration and the criticism. But one thing I won't sacrifice is taking action. This cannot just be about words. This is about us together marching forward in a country and finally birthing the multiracial democracy that America should be.
I understand we're short on time, Mr. Mayor. I have one last question for you. As part of this discussion, as I'm sure you agree, prosecution is a piece of this puzzle of law enforcement and safety in cities. LA County has an upcoming district attorney election in which one candidate, Jackie Lacey, has been backed by police unions opposed to any changes to policing, despite a decades-long legacy of brutality and killings of Black and brown people. One board member with the police labor union recently said regarding protest demands, "I promise you this union will go to our grave fighting." Black Lives Matter community members have been demanding empathy and dialogue with Jackie Lacey for years. But recently, during a protest outside of her home, her husband pulled a gun on a Black Lives Matter co-founder and threatened to shoot her. Since she took office in 2012, she's not once charged a police officer in a shooting at LAPD. Do you still support your endorsement of District Attorney Lacey? Is it time for a change in that office?
It may be, and she's somebody who I've worked with. Just to put in context, my father, before he was district attorney, led the first unit that went after police brutality in the United States of America. I grew up at the dinner table hearing conversations where he'd go to roll calls and officers in a very old and different LAPD, not saying we don't have still progress to make, used to say if you were dying on the ground, bleeding to death, I'd step over you and let you die. The chops that I have and that I know about demand that we do have justice. I was glad to see her put forward prosecution for, you might have seen the video of the beating of somebody who was experiencing homelessness in Boyle Heights in our community. And I think it's important that we do not only prosecute, but that we get convictions. And that's on all of us, by the way, because even when prosecutors do, juries don't convict. This is a moment for America to say, it's not just about prosecutors, it's not just about investigations, but when we line up many of the pieces in the chain, the last link in that chain breaks. And that's people on juries who don't want to convict police officers when they should. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for George Gascon, too. I've served alongside him. It was before he entered the race, and my endorsement was with Miss Lacey. But I want to continue to make sure she does the job that she should be doing. And I want to make sure that that office, no matter who's in it, is going after folks when they commit crimes. And a badge does not protect you. These are very difficult convictions to get, but until people see justice there, they wonder, will justice actually be equal for anyone?
Thank you so much for your time today, Mr. Mayor. We'll see you all again next Tuesday on June 16th with Oakland Mayor Libby Schaaf. Have a good weekend.
Thanks so much.